Thank you very much, Professor Raven. It's a real privilege to speak here today, but I do this with great diffidence. That's because I'm a physical scientist trying to understand only the inanimate world. And that's fairly simple. It's biologists, ecologists, and social scientists who face the most daunting intellectual challenges. And those are the disciplines represented here at this meeting. You may think that as an astronomer I worry about asteroid impacts. I do, but not very much. It was such an event 65 million years ago, which many think did in the dinosaurs. But the probability of such a catastrophe now is no bigger than it was in the remote geological past. It's about 1 in 100,000 every century. So the effects that should worry us much more are the catastrophes induced by humans, whose probability this century is far higher and is rising fast. The Earth has existed for 45 million centuries, but this is the first when one species, ours, is so empowered that it can determine the planet's future. The first when technology could enable us all to live in fulfillment, or, to take a darker view, the century when our follies could foreclose the immense potential for future evolution. We're deep in what's called the Anthropocene. In particular, if our despoilation of nature causes mass extinctions by neglect, by error, or by malign intention, then, to quote E.O. Wilson, it's the action that future generations will least forgive us for. So our focus at this workshop will be to address the threats that stem from humanity's ever heavier collective footprint on the planet, which is, as we all know, depleting resources, impoverishing ecologies, and changing the climate. And also, I think we should address the threats stemming from misuse of biotech and other ever more powerful technologies. Well, I'm an astronomer, not an astrologer, but even with a cloudy crystal ball, there are two things that can be predicted a few decades ahead. First, the world will be more crowded, and secondly, it will have a changing climate. So a word about these two trends. 50 years ago, world population was about 3 billion. It's now 7.3 billion. But the growth is slowing. Indeed, the number of births per year worldwide has leveled off. Nonetheless, world population is forecast to rise to about 9 billion by 2050. That's partly because most people in the developing world are young, they're yet to have children, and they live longer. The age histogram in the developing world is becoming more like it is in Europe. And experts predict continuing urbanization, 70% of people in cities by 2050. And even by 2030, we're told that Lagos, Sao Paulo, and Delhi will have populations above 30 million. And to prevent these megacities becoming turbulent dystopias will surely be a major challenge to governance, as it will be to ensure that rural populations aren't left behind. Population growth seems currently under-discussed. This may be partly because it's deemed by some a taboo subject, tainted by association with eugenics in the 20s and 30s, with Indian policies under Indira Gandhi, and more recently with China's hardline one-child policy, and because forecasts of mass starvation have proved premature. Up to now, food production has kept pace, and famines now stem from wars or maldistribution, not overall shortages. So looking towards 2050, we have to ask, can 9 billion people be fed? We'll be hearing from experts at this workshop. But my layman's impression is that the answer is yes in principle. Improved agriculture, low-till, water conserving, perhaps involving GM crops, together with better engineering to reduce waste, to improve irrigation and so forth, could sustainably feed that number by mid-century. The buzz phrase is sustainable intensification. But there will need to be lifestyle changes. The world couldn't sustain even its present population if everyone lived like Americans do today, each using as much energy and each eating as much beef. But none of us need live as profligately as that. Indeed, all can, by 2050, have a good quality of life, provided that technology is developed appropriately and deployed wisely. That should surely be our message. In Gandhi's famous mantra, there's enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Population trends beyond 2050 are harder to predict, because they'll depend on what people as yet unborn decide about the number and spacing of their children. John Bongartz and others will be discussing this on the program of this meeting. And as we'll hear, if families in Africa remain large, then according to the UN, that continent's population could double again between 2050 and 2100 to 4 billion, thereby raising the global population to around 11 billion. Nigeria alone would then have as big a population as Europe and North America combined, and almost half of the world's children would be in Africa. Optimists remind us that each extra mouth brings also 2 hands and a brain. Nonetheless, the higher the population becomes, the greater surely will be all pressures on resources, especially if the developing world narrows its gap with the developed world in its per capita consumption, and the harder it will be for Africa to escape the poverty trap. As well as rising population, there's a second firm prediction that we can make decades ahead. The world later this century will be warmer. Climate change will hit hardest those who've contributed least to its cause. Heat stress will most hurt those without air conditioning. Crop failure will affect those who already struggle to afford food. Extreme weather events will most endanger those whose homes are fragile. Unlike population trends, climate policies certainly aren't under-discussed, even though they are, sadly, under-acted upon. There are still uncertainties, of course. It's unclear just how fast the climate will change, how much the climatic effects of rising CO2, which are straightforward, are amplified by associated changes in water vapor and clouds. But despite the uncertainties, indeed partly because of the uncertainties, most would agree that under business as usual scenarios, we can't rule out, later this century, really catastrophic warming and tipping points triggering long-term trends like the melting of Greenland's ice cap. Most people agree that that's a possibility. But even those who accept this assertion have diverse views on the policy response. And these stem from differences in economics and ethics. In particular, and this relates to what Parthash Gupta has just said, in how much obligation we should feel towards future generations. Economists who apply a standard discount rate, as for example to those in Born-Lomborg's Copenhagen Consensus, they're in effect writing off what happens beyond 2050. So unsurprisingly, they downplay the priority of addressing climate change in comparison with shorter-term efforts to help the world's poor. But if you care about those who live into the 22nd century and beyond, then, as many economists, including Stern and Weitzman, argue, you will deem it worth paying an insurance premium now to protect those generations against the worst-case scenarios. So, even those who agree that there's a significant risk of climate catastrophe a century hence will differ in how urgently they advocate action today. Their assessment will depend on expectations of future growth and optimism about technological fixes. But above all, it depends on an ethical issue. In optimizing people's life chances, should we, as it were, discriminate on grounds of date of birth? Consider this analogy. Suppose astronomers had tracked an asteroid and calculated that it would hit the Earth in, say, 2080, 63 years from now. Not with certainty, but with, say, 10% probability. Would we relax, saying it's a problem that could be set on one side for 50 years, because people will then be richer, it may turn out it's going to miss the Earth anyway? I don't think we would. I think there'd be a consensus that we should start straight away and do our damnedest to find ways to deflect it or mitigate its effects. Where we'll hear more about climate change, I'll say no more about it now, but a word about other threats to the environment that come from new technologies. Here we can't make firm forecasts decades ahead. Just as smartphones, for instance, would have seemed magic only 20 years ago, we can't conceive what advances might emerge by 2050. We must keep our minds open, or at least ajar, to real drastic transformations. But technology should be our friend. Without applying new science, the world can't provide food and sustainable clean energy for an expanding and more demanding population. The advances we need, providing clean energy, more efficient agriculture, they should offer inspirational challenges for young scientists and engineers. But we do need wisely directed technology. And many of us are anxious that some of these technologies, especially biotech and robotics, are advancing so fast that we may not properly cope with their risks and their ethical implications. And we may therefore have a bumpy ride through this century. And there are portents. The new CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technique is hugely promising for eliminating harmful genes in humans. But it has ethical concerns. And gene drive programs are being promoted as a method of wiping out species. The mosquitoes that carry the Zika virus, for instance. Even in the longer term, to wipe out parasitic imported species, like even the grey squirrels in England. But surely caution is in order here, because there's plainly a risk of unintended disturbances of ecological balances. So these technologies will need regulation on prudential and ethical grounds. Back in the early days of recombinant DNA research, a group of biologists met in Asilomar, California, and at a famous conference agreed guidelines on what experiments should and shouldn't be done. And this seemingly encouraging precedent has triggered several meetings in the last couple of years to discuss the much more powerful recent developments in the same spirit as Asilomar. But today things are very different. The research community is far more broadly international, far more subject to commercial pressure. And what I find scary is that biotech involves small-scale, dual-use equipment. Indeed, biohacking is burgeoning, even as a hobby and competitive game. So I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can, or the tax laws. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. Regulation of huge facilities in the nuclear arena is a doddle in comparison. And this, I think, is a serious concern. I see no obvious solution. We're focusing on the topic of this meeting again. Let's recall what is meant by sustainable development. The Brundtland Commission in 1987 introduced this phrase. It was defined as, I quote, development that meets the needs of the present, especially the poor, without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Well, as I've indicated, there seems no scientific impediment to achieving a sustainable and secure world, where all enjoy a lifestyle better than those in the West do today. We can be technological optimists, but the intractable politics and sociology, the gap between potentialities and what actually happens, engenders pessimism. Politicians look to their own voters and the next election. We downplay what's happening even now in faraway countries, and we discount too heavily the problems we'll leave for future generations. Our responsibility to our children, to the poorest, and to our stewardship of life's diversity surely demands that we don't leave a depleted and hazardous world. And here, the great religious faiths can be our allies. The Catholic Church, for instance, transcends normal political constraints. There's no gainsaying its global reach, nor its durability and long-term vision, nor its focus on the world's poor. And that's why the Holy Father's encyclical on climate and environment was so important. As Margaret Archer said, it had huge resonance and smoothed the path towards a consensus at the Paris Climate Conference in December 2015. And Partha Gupta, along with the climate scientist Ram Ramanathan, who sadly isn't here at this meeting, achieved great leverage by helping to lay the scientific groundwork through the study week on climate and environment. So in summary, the pressures of rising population, climate change, and the risk of misuse of powerful technologies will aggravate the type of devastation that this workshop is about: loss of biodiversity. And let's remind ourselves why this matters. We're clearly harmed if fish stocks dwindle to extinction. There are plants in the rainforest whose genes may be useful to us. But the spiritual value too. To quote E.O. Wilson again, I quote, "At the heart of the environmentalist worldview is a conviction that human physical and spiritual health depends on the planet Earth. Natural ecosystems, forests, coral reefs, marine blue waters, maintain the world as we would wish it to be maintained. Our body and our mind evolved to live in this particular planetary environment and no other." But even this is perhaps too anthropocentric a focus. Many of those who call themselves environmentalists would proclaim that biodiversity, the intricate variety and beauty of the natural world, has intrinsic value over and above its benefits to us humans. And of course, the encyclical affirmed that humans had a duty towards the rest of God's creation. So we all, those of all faiths and none, surely want to sign up to this goal. But there's a big problem in achieving it, basically because our secular institutions, despite their global range, don't plan long-term enough. And given the surroundings we're in, I'd like to end with a particular thought. Those who built St. Peter's Basilica and Europe's great cathedrals thought the world might only last another 1,000 years. They knew of nothing beyond Europe. But despite these constricted horizons, in both time and space, despite the deprivation and harshness of their lives, despite their primitive technology and their meager resources, they built these huge and glorious structures which they never lived to see finished, and which uplift our spirits centuries later. What a contrast this is to so much of our discourse today. Unlike our forebears, we know a great deal about our world, and indeed about what lies beyond. Technologies our ancestors couldn't have conceived enrich our lives and our understanding. Many phenomena still make us fearful, but the advance of science spares us from much irrational dread. Unlike our forebears, we know that we are stewards of a precious pale blue dot in a vast cosmos, a planet with a future measured in billions of years, whose fate depends on humanity's collective actions this century. So it's surely shameful that our horizon is shorter than that of our forebears in earlier centuries. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support system is vulnerable to disruption and breakdown. There's too little horizon scanning to minimize long-term risks. The stakes are high and the threats are real. It's a wise maxim that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. And they give the last word to a secular sage, the great biologist Peter Medawar. I quote, "The bells that toll for mankind are like the bells of alpine cattle. They are attached to our own necks, and it must be our fault if they do not make a tuneful and melodious sound." Thank you very much.